Well, thank you so much. That was quite an introduction. Thank you, Andreas. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah? Okay, so I would like to just say thank you very much also to the BRLSI for hosting this talk and to Andreas for organizing it. Welcome to everyone, and welcome to everybody who's joining online. I know quite a lot of extra people have joined online who were going to come but then couldn't make it and have now joined, so that's great. And I know that the participants online include people from South Africa and the USA. So welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for coming. As Andreas said, I've been an activist, a worker, a researcher, a professor, excuse me, for all these 50 years. And I was a co-founder of the group that Andreas mentioned, the Gender and Violence Research Centre at the University of Bristol, with Ellen Melos, the late Ellen Melos. Some of you will have known Ellen, and she is deeply, deeply, deeply missed. The centre does activist-based research when it can, and also is committed to raising, where possible, the voices of survivors. So what we're going to talk about today is indeed features of domestic violence and abuse, the struggle against domestic violence and abuse and violence against women, but not hopefully sinking into the depressing side, because it is a depressing issue, but rather the transforming journey of activism to challenge violence against women across the world. So we're going to focus instead on visions, resistance, and strategies for change. I'll talk a bit about how globally the women's movements across the world have changed and are changing how we view and how we react to domestic violence and abuse, and the importance of activism for social change in developing services and policy and so on. But just to start with a health warning, these are highly disturbing issues. Some of you may have experience of them. And if you are affected by any of the issues in this talk, do take care of yourselves. Do talk to somebody. Do get support and help. Well, looking at the news, it can be a bit overwhelming, can't it, regarding domestic violence and violence against women. From the murder of Sarah Everard in 2021 by a serving police officer, to the murder of Sarah Sharif, a 10-year-old girl of South Asian heritage who, as you know, her family has just been convicted of her murder. From the recent Pelicot case in France of that wonderful French woman, so brave, subjected to a huge numbers of rapes while unconscious by her husband and her husband's friends, to mass rapes, sexual violence in war and conflict, for example, currently in Ukraine, in Sudan, and in Tigray in Ethiopia, where the sexual violence is continuing despite the truce and the ending of hostilities there. But we have come so far. It doesn't seem sometimes as though we have, but we have. We've come so far in combating violence against women and girls compared to where we were. So we need to remember this and not get overwhelmed by how far there is to go. So the tenor of this talk is that despite the distressing subject, there are also things to celebrate and inspire us. That's the book that Andreas mentioned. That's the 10th of my books on violence against women, my last one really. It's a history of activism against domestic violence in the UK, but also across the world. And I've written it really as a history of activism, while at least some of us, these activists, are still with us. The cover is of a demonstration in Mexico City in 2020 against femicide, the murder of women, which is very high in Mexico. And the red shoes are put in public places. Some of you will know. And each shoe represents a woman murdered, and they are coloured red for blood. Copies of the book are there, and as I say, as Andreas said, I intend to quote a couple of poems, and they're in the other book, the poetry book there, which has a lot of poems related to my work on violence against women all over the world. And I'll be selling them at the reduced price, as Andreas said, half price for the history one, of £10 and £8. So, as you know, violence against women across the world is, I would say, a global catastrophe. The World Health Organization, very august body, estimates 1 in 3 women worldwide experience physical violence from intimate partners and families across a lifetime. A 2023 UN report found that 736 million women experienced intimate physical and sexual violence across a lifetime, and of those 640 million would be from their husbands. Global disaster, I call it. But some groundbreaking studies, multi-country studies by the WHO, show the very high percentages of domestic violence worldwide. For example, between 30 and 62%-ish. This is women who are ever married women they're called, who have experienced physical and sexual violence. 53% in Bangladesh, 37% in some parts of Brazil, 38% New Zealand, 59% some parts of Ethiopia, and 61% some parts of Peru. And of course, the global disaster is not only domestic violence and abuse, but also rape and sexual assault. Somebody just coming in. We need some help, maybe. Welcome. As well as domestic violence and abuse, female genital mutilation experienced by 200 million women at the moment in the world, rape and sexual assault, forced and early marriage, sexual violence and torture and rape in war and conflict zones, sexual trafficking of women, so-called honor-based violence and honor killings, where the young women and some young men are murdered by their family to restore in some way family honor. So I would say it is a global catastrophe, but there are the transforming women's movements for change. So women's movements across the world have made many changes, and I would say that that has been made by many, many, many thousands of women and quite a few good men making change. And if you think about it, domestic violence and violence against women has been ignored, an ignored, invisible issue throughout history, hasn't it? Over the millennia, almost everywhere, women have largely been regarded as chattels of men, and abuse and violence has been shatteringly common, almost universal, across the world, with almost no one paying it much attention. Of course, abused women have always helped each other throughout history, and there was attention to the issue, especially in Western countries in the 19th century, in the Victorian era. But really, it was not until the middle of the 20th century, the 1960s, that social activism to make social change on gender-based violence finally started on a large scale. And my generation and others from then on really have been the first generations to really take on this issue. And I suggest that we are all lucky. We're lucky enough to live in a time when these issues are finally being addressed, to some extent at least. First time in history on such a scale. So even though the issue remains so very traumatic, that's a pretty inspiring thought. Rebecca and Russell Dobash are highly esteemed researchers, very unusually in this field. They are a husband and wife team, and they've done amazingly influential work for 50 years. Very respected writing. In 1992, they wrote on the formation of the women's movement, working on these issues 25 years before that. And what they wrote was, the great mobilization of women began with a vision, supported by action. The vision was of a world transformed. So the importance then of social activism. In this field, activists, some of whom are here today or online, have worked non-stop to challenge quite heroically, working non-stop for so many years to bring the issue into public view. Really quite heroic. When I started out, there was no attention to the issue of domestic violence, let alone sexual violence. No services, no help for women experiencing domestic violence, no counselling, no refuges, nowhere to go, nothing. And then, under the impetus of the women's movement of the late 60s, early 70s, it all burst into being. A passionate movement erupted, really, all over the world, not just in the West by any means, engaging in direct action, engaging in campaigning in many countries. And those were, for those of you who might have been part of that, they were passionate days of zeal and change, basically making it all up from the start. So from those early glimmerings, we began to get action, and we began through the fire of a social movement to get campaigning and new services set up. Women formed collectives, taking on the issue of domestic violence in a way never done before, which was to set up refuges. They're safe houses for women and children fleeing violence. And my book documents the struggle to provide refuges. It was quite a revolutionary struggle at the time against resistance in the early 70s, resistance all around, really. But immediately a refuge was set up by a group of volunteer women with no money whatsoever, often in short-life property. The minute the refuge would open, women and children started throwing their fates to the winds and taking the unprecedented action at the time to leave their husbands, who they may well at that period have promised to obey. They were suddenly trying to get themselves out of violent partnerships and marriages, often without warning, and they were doing something even more extraordinary. They were then going to live together with groups of other women in safe houses at secret locations run by women. It's commonplace now, of course, but then it was quite remarkable and entirely unprecedented. So I would say that in a significant way, the very fabric of marriage and personal and sexual relations between men and women was being challenged. Refuge and shelters are now commonplace across the world, even in countries of the global south, which initially would have a more community-based response. And challenging domestic violence, as we know, is part of criminal justice work and popular culture. It's almost impossible to conceive of what it was like then when it first started, from a base of pretty much zero societal interest. As I say, it seems quite common these days to have a refuge, but then the brave challenge that it was at the time is without doubt something to celebrate. And what those groups of women did was breathtaking. Things have moved on from there, not only in Western countries, but other countries also, developing services, policy and practice, research, strategies across localities like we have in Bristol and in Bath, awareness raising, worker training, support for survivors, training for survivors, with all of us working so hard to make a better world for abused women. And of course, I would just say that men do experience domestic violence also, and where they do, they need to have support and help. But we know in our hearts, don't we, that the people who experience most domestic violence across the world are women. Women's Aid coordinates refuges nationally across the 4 countries of the UK and has one of its headquarters in Bristol. And there are many local projects, of course, and policies going on. Some of you might have been involved in some of those. Great local work here by Next Link, by Julian House, by Voices, and by SARSAS working on sexual violence and rape. And if you know anybody who needs a refuge, then they can get support and help now, locally. But also nationally. There's a national helpline now, the National Domestic Abuse Helpline at 0800 2000 24/7. So in these 50 years I've been working on it, there's been so many changes, but one positive change, I think, is the younger generation who now learn about it in schools. They learn about domestic violence in schools. They're taught about how to have healthy, more equal relationships. And many of them, not all, of course, as we know, but these developments are slow, many of them are trying to live now in different ways and build strong and healthy relationships, and perhaps take the issue on and make the world a safer place in the future. So I want to give our support and our respect to young people who are taking this issue forward. Internationally, I've worked on domestic violence and on so-called honor-based violence and honor killing, honor murder, sexual violence, maimings and rape in war, and things like that. So, I mean, you do have to stay positive when you work in this field. It's a hard field. And the story I just wanted to say, though, which is cheering, is that when I started out, no one was working on rape and sexual violence in conflict. Almost no one. No one. Now, I sometimes work in Paris in a program organized by my dear colleague, Nazand Bejihani. We work with groups of workers and students who are working practically on the issue of sexual violence in conflict. And my job is to try and inspire them. And at the last one, there were young workers there from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There were women activists there from Peru. There were people working on the Istanbul Convention, which is a European-wide convention on domestic violence. There were activists from China. There were, of course, sexual violence in war activists from Ukraine were there. Mexico, women working on femicide, and the UN, of course, which develops global instruments which are of great importance, even though remote, perhaps, from local struggle. And it was so inspiring for me. It was always tear-jerking to see all these young people so committed, so dedicated, working so hard on sexual violence in conflict zones when before there was nothing. Internationally, I've worked in many countries, as Andreas said, and the sort of work I've done has always been transnational collaborations, which are collaborations between partners in the West and partners in the global South country, perhaps, always led by the organizations, perhaps women's organizations, from the global South country concerned, and trying to avoid Western dominance. And that, I can tell you, is a hard thing to do, and you need all your humility to do it. I'm going to share with you a few examples. So these women are Yazidi women. This is I've worked extensively in Iraq, in the Kurdistan part of Iraq, which is in the northeast near the border with Iran, the Iranian border. And this was a few years ago from the sexual slavery days of Daesh, ISIS. And these girls, obviously they're dressed up in traditional clothing. They don't normally look like that. These girls had been liberated, rescued from Daesh. Several of them had seen their parents murdered in front of them. And at least some of them would have been sexual slaves. And they'd been released. And here they are now in a refugee camp. And this woman on the right is a wonderful, wonderful Kurdish woman who was training them to be photojournalists, which they've gone on being. There's one of them. As you can see, she's in the refugee camp, but she's got her camera. There's a couple more of them. And how wonderful is that? They were kind of imprisoned under the ISIS days, under Daesh, and they are now doing this. So that's, sometimes there's wonderful things that happen. Another example. This is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I wasn't involved with this. Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this is the Minova rape case, quite famous, a few years ago. And there had been massive pillage, rape in the local area by soldiers. And they put in place this pioneering rape case. Now, if you can see, everybody in the back is men, right? And everybody is also a soldier. Can you see? They're soldiers. And they are the rapists. And these women are testifying about the rape they'd experienced, and so they're completely disguised to protect them. There are attempts by governments to deal with sexual violence in conflict, and also the global instruments that I mentioned, which are really important. But this was something a bit different, the Minova rape trial. There had been 1,000 rapes, and women had testified disguised, as you saw, but it didn't end up that great because only 2 low-ranking officers were found guilty. And unfortunately, since that time, some of the women have been besieged by violence and have had to hide in the bush and run away and so on. And the compensation of $15,000, which they were each meant to receive, has not been paid. But it was the beginning, and lessons were learned, reports were written, research was done on it to move forward in how to deal with these kinds of rape cases. But just look at that. Isn't that brave? It's just so brave, it just takes your breath away, doesn't it? There she is with these rapists all behind there. This is where I've worked in Uganda, where I've had the honour of working with an inspiring women's NGO, Mifumi, who were hoping to join us online. And it's another example of women's courage, where these are village women who are working against violence against women, full of good cheer. And we were, me and my South Asian colleague, Rabi Tiara from the University of Warwick, we worked there with the actual researchers were the village women and men who often had almost no education, but we all worked together on an action research project, showing that despite the difficulties, you can join hands to make strategies for change, even across such huge almost insurmountable difficulties and differences, extreme differences obviously in wealth, in power, in ethnicity, position, the history of colonization, and so on. But we did do the work. In that occasion, we were working on bride price, which is where men have to pay with cows or goats or money or something for their wife, and the connection between bride price and later domestic violence and poverty. And that work we did was really quite successful, but they also did a lot of practical work, and it led to a modification of the Ugandan constitution. So, isn't that great? These two are two of the senior village activists working tirelessly. Jane Rose on your left, and Immaculate on this side, Immaculate. And they have worked tirelessly, supporting women in their village, in the whole local area, taking women in, helping women who have been abused, at considerable local danger, to support survivors and to do everything they can. They work tirelessly. They gave their permission to show this photo and to speak of them previously. And I'm just going to read you a tiny bit of a poem about them by name, which they also knew about and gave their permission to, in the Cirrus Clouds book. They work ceaselessly, with nothing, in the villages. Activists on domestic violence in the UK and elsewhere could learn much from your courage and commitment and vision, dear Jane Rose and Immaculate. You have devoted your lives to helping abused women and children. What a gift and an inspiration indeed. Please know that you are heroes and beacons to all around you. Thank you deeply from all of us who struggle to end domestic violence, not only in Africa, but across the world. Jane Rose and Immaculate. I have to say that a couple of months ago, Immaculate was murdered by one of her neighbours because of her work. So let us perhaps take a moment to honour and remember women like Immaculate, who have given so much in the struggle against domestic violence. Working on honour-based violence in Iraqi Kurdistan, another example, I worked with stunningly brave and committed activists, including Nazan Bejihani, who is a very well-known and extremely well-thought-of activist on women's issues across the world, and also a very well-known Kurdish poet, Nazan. I spoke to her yesterday about giving this talk. As you see in the background, on the right there, they're Peshmerga, freedom fighters, Kurdish freedom fighters. So we work together, and in that case, you work in different ways in different places. In that case, we investigated violence in the name of honour and developed the first ever action plan in the Middle East on the issue. I'm really proud of my part in that, although it was led by these wonderful Kurdish activists. The Iraqi Kurdistan government has committed to putting it into place, although they haven't done a great deal, but they've done some things. One of the things that did happen while we were doing it was that they got all the mullahs across the whole region, all the mullahs, to preach against honour-based violence at Friday prayers. So it's an enormous privilege working with Kurdish women activists in that situation in Iraqi Kurdistan, who work in incredibly difficult conditions, often with fatwas on their heads, and they are awe-inspiring to work with. Nazan gave me permission to use this photo. That's me, of course, and Nazan. And this is Nazan's mother, who has since deceased. And she was a wonderful woman. She didn't read and write herself, but she was so proud of her heroic daughter. She has since died, and she is buried alongside her husband and her 3 sons, all of whom were killed in the Kurdish struggle. I asked Nazan if it was okay, and she said, of course. So I just want to read you another poem, a version of it's in that book, about the work that we did on violence in the name of honour. Of course, this poem contains distressing images, but it's important to be aware that honour-based violence doesn't only occur in the Middle East or South Asia. It has occurred across the world and still does, and it's not confined to any particular religion, for example, Islam. This poem is dedicated to all survivors of and victims of violence in the name of honour, and to the brave women activists with whom I've had the huge, huge privilege of working. Did I just say it does contain distressing images? A girl and a boy are playing. A girl and a boy. She leads the play in a sweet way. He giggles, following her with adulation in his eyes, laughing and tumbling together. They don't know yet. They don't know that in the future she will probably have to obey him, her younger male relative. Never go out at night unless with male kin. Rarely enter public spaces. Do whatever her husband demands. He will probably have free rein. Things are better, of course, in the cities. But in some towns and villages, she could still be killed in the name of honour. We talked with a woman whose nose had been cut off. We met with the relatives of girls burned to death, with women who had been imprisoned, mutilated, or, and this is really common, forced to marry their rapist. Not anymore, though. Things are on the move. A new type of woman won't stand for it. Old ways are being challenged through the courage, the vigilance of women activists. Many have fought as freedom fighters for the liberation of their homeland, exposed genocides and gassings. Now they challenge honour killing. They have to keep going, despite death threats, despite religious fatwas against them, despite media coverage which dishonours them by name. Where am I? In their traumatized country, trying to sprout anew. Now they make progress. They have pushed through a change in the law that used to say murder of women for honour was not murder. They've changed that. They campaign against beatings and shamings. They set up some services. A few shelters with armed guards are established. The government says it will make changes. Honour violence is called dishonourable on TV. The authorities are forced to act. A new consensus begins to emerge. The courageous women stand firm as tigers. Sometimes they cry at night, but they are making something fresh. Perhaps that girl and that little boy will be able to walk free. Hope has arrived. For now, she leads the play in a sweet way. He giggles, following her with adulation in his eyes, laughing and tumbling together. So, I would say in almost all countries, there is some attempt to begin to take violence against women seriously. There are campaigns, there might be outreach and counselling and support projects set up in almost all countries, refuges, safe spaces for women and children, legal advances, passing domestic violence acts like we have here. And they also have quite a good one in South Africa and in Iraq, actually. Criminal justice advances, like all the police here now, have domestic violence training, although they don't always, well, whatever. Anyway, they have it. Education work in schools, public education, violence against women training, the development of good practice guidelines, some of you might be involved in if you're in the field, perpetrators programs to hold perpetrators accountable, coordinated community responses across localities, particularly in North America actually, but here too, action plans and policy and strategy development across a local area, as I mentioned, and of course the global instruments. They can help, the UN declarations. They don't have any teeth, but they can still help, particularly the conventions, and famously, of course, CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So, the transforming struggle. As I've said, there are campaigning groups, there are action groups in many, many countries of the world. For example, I've worked with a special cell to support, it's called the Special Cell, but it's a women's project, to support women and children in Maharashtra, in India. And these brave women work in the middle of Indian police stations to support victims, which is no easy job. Musasa, the wonderful Musasa project in Zimbabwe, which has been a pioneer. The very powerful women's movements in India, you will have heard of. Sometimes there are these terrible rapes that we hear about, and in India, very misogynist situations, and those powerful women's movements are right there. Another example, international grassroots campaigns in the global south, this is a while ago, which happened to get rape recognized as a war crime. And it has been, finally, although it's still a bit backwards and forwards. But anyway, huge grassroots struggle by grassroots organizations in the global south, for example, in the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific. So I think it's important to say there is violence against women activists in all countries of the world, even where it is hardest. For example, currently in Afghanistan, that I know of, women who are currently working underground in Afghanistan around supporting women experiencing sexual violence without being found by the Taliban. And the occupied Palestinian territories, there's a project going on in Bristol by some of my colleagues, which is, despite the difficulties right now, they are working together with the people in Palestine to develop better responses in hospitals and for GPs and so on. So, to different levels in different places, the work goes on. Of course, it's hard. There are huge levels of sexual violence in conflict still, huge levels of domestic violence, lots of cutbacks, projects in this country, for example, projects and refuges being closed down, losing their funding, lots of women's services, loss of women's services to wider general initiatives. The fragility of what we call the VORG sector, the violence against women and girls sector. It's always really vulnerable to losing its funding. Lack of sustainability, massive problems fighting against misogynistic attitudes, racism, discrimination against lesbians and gay men, LGBT plus issues, and also disability issues. Constant battle. Patriarchal attitudes, attacks and values, which we quite often see on the TV now, don't we, coming out of the extreme right wing. Backlash, serious backlash in some places, and direct attack. But we move forward. 3 takeaways I'd like to suggest. One is that taking on violence and abuse is a noble and brave thing to do as humans. And some of you have made your own contributions, I know. The importance of activism to social change, activism of all types to social change, and some of you again here and online are involved, I know, in making social change of all different types on gender-based violence. It's an important way to spend the one precious human life we have. I feel honoured and proud to have been able to devote most of my one precious human life to this issue. And thirdly, building strength together, supporting each other on a personal level, building healthy relationships, so we can build towards a future in which domestic violence and abuse and violence against women and girls are things of the past. There is, although it can look bleak, there is an optimistic future. So before I finish, perhaps let us take a moment to remember and celebrate and learn from the women's activists and the women's activist movements. Without them, we would not be where we are today. For me and for many of us, we're now passing on the baton. And I feel it's a great privilege to have played a part over these 50 years in this unprecedented, historically unique and unrepeatable, from the 1960s onwards till now, unrepeatable period of research policy activist development over the last 50 years. It's what a privilege, I think. This is a tapestry, the tapestry of work on domestic violence and violence against women. The idea was first put forward by my colleague, Professor Liz Kelly, who's a very well-known feminist activist professor. And the idea is that this is a tapestry, the tapestry of our work, and each thread is the work of a person, somebody like you, shining out, making a difference, weaving together with others. So together we build with the thread of each person's contribution shining. You cannot undo it again. You can pull it out a bit, it gets attacked, and you can, some of it will get pulled out, but then it knots up. It won't go all the way back again to the beginning. It has to go forward. So it's like building resistance to violence against women and domestic violence is like making a beautiful tapestry, as I say, with each thread being someone like you. Together we build it. There it is again, it's just such a beautiful idea. And the only way for the tapestry of work on violence against women to go is to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So passing on the baton, despite the hardness of the work, we must continue with grit, determination, politics, placing survivors at the centre, support for each other, and humour. This struggle will go on way beyond our lives. The cusp of change is here on violence against women, and it will go on way, way, way into the future. So, after the millennia of silence, we can perhaps continue to try to make something new, passing on the baton with respect and wishing good luck to all those involved, some of whom are online, all those involved in doing so, wishing good luck to everybody in moving forward in this great human struggle for justice. And perhaps, if you haven't already, you might like to add your own golden thread. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill. What a life spent combating violence against women, and what a thought-provoking talk. How much humanity still has to learn is just beggars belief in today's society. But we've now reached the Q&A stage, so we're going to start in the room. There's some activity already online, but when you do ask a question in the room, can you please speak directly into the top of the microphone, otherwise the people online won't hear you. Who would like to go for the first question? No? Should I go online and have a look there?
You might think, how much water can one woman drink? Do ask anything you want, by the way. You know, anything is fine.
I've got something here. How does the UK's women's movement rediscover our heart and reject models that are no longer women-centred?
I don't think I quite got it, Andreas. Sorry.
Okay. How does the UK's women movement rediscover our heart and reject models that are no longer women-centred?
Yeah, it's a total struggle. I mean, one of the things that happens is that local projects like Women's Aid Refuges get taken over by more generalist organisations and lose their feminist politics. And it's a total struggle to keep that going. Also, I think it is important to remember the history, because many, quite a few workers in the field now don't know this history. And so it's a constant struggle, because obviously now things have moved more into the mainstream from the margins. So keeping the politics of resistance and the visions for social change can be a little more difficult. I'm sure some of you in the audience are involved in this work and might want to comment on that. It is a constant struggle. It is a constant struggle.
Okay, there's another question online, and saying obviously a lot of good work is taking place in terms of preventing violence against women. But given that the cause, the provocateurs are men, what work is being done to actually, with men specifically themselves, to make sure that they become educated around violence?
That they are educated?
Yes, so what work is being done to educate men on this?
Well, as I did mention at one point, there is now stuff happening in schools. So young boys and young girls will get something about it in schools. The motto of all of this work is to support the victim, survivor, and to hold the perpetrator accountable. So therefore, we have perpetrators programs in this country particularly, and in many countries actually. They started one in Mifumi in Uganda. Perpetrators programs where men would go to do a program to try and teach them, to try and get them to recognize their behavior and change. And they can be successful, not always. Obviously, public education around the issue would help to challenge It's hard to do it, but have been some advances, and there are now many perpetrators programs and an organisation called Respect, which coordinates those, which is fantastic. So we creep forward, really, doing the best we can.
Okay. And do you feel that more needs to be done in the main educational establishments, in schools, to promote violence against women in terms of actually combating and eradicating it?
In schools?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I'm going to give a talk actually in my old school, going back to my old school to give a talk shortly. They do get some material, but not really, as I said, I've been optimistic saying they get it. But it's obviously not nearly enough. They need more, and it needs to be ongoing. Sometimes peer-to-peer education can help with this kind of work. I mean, you move forward little by little, and then you go back again, and then you move forward little by little. But there are programs. I mean, I worked in India developing a program for use in schools in South Bombay, which they've done to try and teach boys, particularly and girls also, about domestic violence. And some cases, they even have now work in this country and others in primary schools. So it's beginning. So I don't know if any of you have any experience of that.
Okay, I think Anne online also says they provide a program for men, just if people are interested. Right, we now go to the room. There's a gentleman there. If you could pass the microphone along.
So I would just say that Reprovide and Provide and Iris are really important initiatives that were started by the same team that I mentioned who are doing the work in Palestine and are developing it, and it's being rolled out nationally. So great work.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. My name is Farem Jenny from Zimbabwe, and I'm so happy and glad that you put clearly a lot of issues. But may I suggest to you that before you pass on the baton, if you will look around, especially in this room, I think we are less than 5 men in here, and 3/4 of people who are here are women. And back home in Africa, whenever you talk about gender, automatically what comes into one's mind is you're talking about women. But we have realized along the way that gender is not just about your masculinity, but it's about male and female. So may I kindly ask that before you pass on the baton, can you deliberately have maybe symposiums or many lectures or guest lectures of this kind where you deliberately involve men? Because I feel as men, we are secluded in one way or the other because it's a women's thing. And for as long as you pass on the baton just to the good sisters and aunties who are here and not on to men, it will be difficult.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, of course, men have to be involved in this struggle, as I did mention at the beginning. And it is the case that whenever you have a gathering, it's almost always women and just very, very few good men coming. But there are initiatives. There are, for example, I worked a bit in the Alexander Township in Johannesburg, where they have men, a huge demonstrations and campaigns by men against rape in the township, which is incredibly brave of those men. And I think when men sometimes do take up these issues, it is quite hard and you do need support and help. So men need to be part of it too. And we know that many men are trying to change and do something different now, live in a different way. And that's hopeful. I don't know quite what else to say. Mifumi, the organisation in Uganda, have started a men's group, for example, which is really a powerful group, and so on. So there are these things that happen, but it's a really good point. Thank you so much. That now, probably in the future, men need to be involved in this, since it's the men who are usually the perpetrators. So thank you very much for the question.
Good, thank you. A lady in the front.
Good evening. Sorry, yeah, no, it's working. Good evening, yeah. I wanted to ask, what do you think are the best strategies to deal with the backlash that invariably sort of happens when there's women's activism on these subjects, right? I was thinking even like in Europe and America currently, you know, you see a lot of sort of far-right activism directly against feminism, for example, or women's advances. So knowing that it's coming, and it sort of happened whenever there's been any type of advances in women's rights, you know, there was activism against the suffragettes, for example. So it's a historic, you know, it's a historic pattern. What do you think are the strategies that can be employed to lessen it, or?
Yeah. I think there always has to be multi-stranded strategies at different levels, from, you know, awareness raising to possibly legal things. And it's hard, isn't it? These things are really hard. It's hard to combat these people with these views. When the women's movement was really powerful, it was easier in a way, because there was a powerful social movement going on, which is less so now. But I know people in the left are doing what they can and so on. It's really difficult. It's really difficult. You have to keep on going. You have to just keep on going, like those women in Kurdistan do. I mean, I don't know if you have any ideas yourself. You just have to keep on going, combating that sort of stuff whenever you can, and maybe putting in place alternative projects or starting alternative campaigning. You know, say changes in the law can sometimes help a little bit to stop that kind of thing happening. I don't know if you have anything to add yourself, or.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was wondering if there are arguments that can be used to reach people in those kinds of views, or if it's not possible. It's because this thing. Sorry, I was wondering if there are sort of specific arguments that you can employ to sort of sway people's minds, or if there are specific ways that, you know, these policies can be put in place. I don't know. I mean, if I knew, you know, I'd have the solution to the world's problems, but.
I mean, as I said before, there are wider strategies across a whole locality that can be drawn on, somehow to make it clear that this sort of thing doesn't only hurt the women, it hurts the men too, it hurts everybody. So that if you want to move forward, you need to stop that. It's a really difficult question, and I think it's really hard. It's really hard at the moment, isn't it, with the right-wing gathering all over the world. But I just think we have to keep trying. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a weak answer, but that's all you can do. You have to keep trying where you can.
Absolutely. Okay, there's a lady here. And maybe then one or two other questions, and then we call it a day.
Thank you. I just want to come back to your question, and certainly in the wonderful speech that was given by Jill, the word activism was used a lot. This Saturday, across this country and other countries, there were demonstrations against Trump, against his inauguration, and his support, obviously, of the terrible things, well, against the attacks in women in the USA. So I would say Saturday, get your local demonstration. If you look online, there are them across this country. So I think that's a good place to meet other activists. And that's a very important strategy.
Yes.
And an opportunity to work with other people who are wanting change and aren't quite sure what to do, but it's a very empowering activity to actually be involved in. Thank you.
Thank you, absolutely. Direct action is really good in this situation.
Good. Get involved, basically, is the message. Any more questions in the room? Oh, there's a lady there and a lady at the back.
Thank you, Kay, for that. It's really helpful.
Jill, I was 2 years ago in Uganda, and I was a guest in a village for 2 days, and the women's groups came, and they all gave wonderful little plays, and they were mostly to do with their slightly aggressive husbands, and I'm wondering if this was your influence. We got the message across. It was the Acholi tribe, Negulu. Was that your area? Okay.
Okay, we probably got time for one more question, unless somebody else got. Oh, there's more hands coming up. Well, if we keep the questions short, we might get another couple in.
Thank you for this amazing insight about gender-based violence across the world. So I have been involved in the movement not because it was my passion, but because I had no other choice. I had to do it. So that was the context in which I got involved. So my question is, considering that across the world, when we look at sexual abuse in context of conflict, we look at the global south, that many of the imperialism, capitalism, and also neoliberal mindset were background that encourage most of the abuses. But when we talk about gender-based violence, in most of the time, we don't include those into the discussion. So how can we, moving forward, make sure that we involve that so people are aware of the background and how we can make sure that these voices and these mindsets are included in the talk about gender-based violence? Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I completely grasp the question. You were talking about expanding the gender-based violence work to...
Mostly where I come from, when we talk about gender-based violence, they draw a problem tree where below the roots, they say cultural or religious norms that brought the gender-based violence, which is not false, it's true, but I'm thinking, moving forward, how can we make sure that we include in the discussion factors like neoliberalism, capitalism, colonization, that were the roots of most of the problem? How do we change the narrative towards that?
Thank you very much for that question. And of course, yes, I mean, we have to look at the role of capitalism and neoliberalism and so on, and colonialization and all of those things which can be part of this. It's hard to do everything, of course, but it is important to be aware of those issues and to be aware of some of the roots of this type of thing in patterns of the colonial and imperial exploitation around the world. So it's important to try to expand the analysis, I would feel, and the work, but it's quite hard to do. I'm quite a believer in public education and consciousness raising and groups that often, they can have some sort of role to play, as well as the more political role and the direct action and all those kinds of things. That's the best I can say. I mean, you might have a better answer yourself, I don't know.
Well, I suppose, one of the things we need to do as a society is to realize that cultural and social conventions are there to be challenged, wherever they are. And I think that's one way of getting started. Daniela online, by the way, has encouraged us all to remind us about the 1 Million Women March on the 17th of February. So please have a look at that. And we probably have got room for one more question. Who would like to ask the final questions of the evening? This lady here. Okay.
Thanks very much for a very positive talk. I really appreciated how you expressed how things have moved from the 60s, which is marvelous. But I think it's a real point that most of the perpetrators are men. And I wondered, on a positive note, if there were any collective organizations that are joining men together, because at the end of the day, it is men that have got to change. And it's lovely to hear that you know, about the good men, but there've never quite been enough of them to, you know, and it'd be great if there was a lot more activism within men's group. And I wondered if you'd heard of any.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll just emphasize again about the 100 Million Women March. It's an amazing march that happens every year in London. Yes, there are groups of men working on these things. Yes, there are sort of consciousness raising, if you like, for men going on in some places. And of course, it has sometimes been difficult, as I think with the previous question, that, you know, men sometimes don't feel very welcome in the women's organizations, and they are women-only organizations often. But there are some of these things going on, and I'm pleased that that's happening, and it needs to happen a lot more. All of this stuff needs to happen a lot more, of course. But that would be a good way forward for men somehow to learn not to behave in those ways. Although, of course, it has a lot to do with male power in the society, doesn't it? So it's a tough one. But we just have to keep doing everything we can for as long as we can.